Welcome to another tidbit from the book of the prophet Isaiah. We have come to chapter 7. When you read chapter 7 and want to understand it, you need to be aware of both the historical context and the literary context. This is the first explicit mentioning of the Assyrian kingdom in the book of Isaiah, and the last episode in which the Assyrians are involved comes in chapters 36 to 39. So this is the beginning and the end of the Assyrians in this particular book. As you look at the literary context, you quickly realize, of course, that chapter 7 and onwards are reusing some of the images you find in the previous chapters, but you also realize that chapters 7 to 12 in a sense form a unity in itself. It is a unit. So let me advise you to read not only chapter 7 but also the subsequent chapters 8 to 12 in one go. And let's then jump to the opening of chapter 7 and look a little more on both historical and literary context. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with the Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. The two kingdoms, Syria, Aram, with its capital Damascus, and the northern kingdom of Ephraim, also called Israel, they joined forces. What they really wanted was to force Judah to enter into a covenant with them in the attempt to stop the growing power of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire from the northern part of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, had begun to grow, and Syria and Israel thought that they were able to stop them. That was not a very wise observation or thinking. Within short, they were crushed, both of them. This is then the situation, and this is the situation in which the Lord speaks to the prophet in verse 3. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out, you and your son Shear-Yashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. Now there are a couple of phrases here that at first seem quite unimportant, but they play a role in the literary thematic message of these chapters. First, why is Isaiah to take his son with him? The son has a strange name. That is, most names in other languages sound strange. This was a strange name. Shear-Yashub means a remnant returns. A remnant is converted. A little later, actually in the book of Isaiah, in this section, you have exactly the same Hebrew phrase where the meaning is important. In chapter 10, verse 21, a remnant will return. I read from the NIV, New International Version. So Shear-Yashub is important because of the message of his name. Isaiah had sons with strange names. But then there is another expression. They were to meet the king at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field. Now, from a literary perspective, this is significant because as we move to the second and the last major episode in the book of Isaiah with the Assyrians, the same location pops up. In chapter 36, the Assyrian army are besieging Jerusalem. And it is said as such, then the king of Assyria, in verse 2, sent his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. Lachish had been crushed. There's exciting archaeological digs and findings when it comes to Lachish from this period. When the commander stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, and so on, went out to him. So this is an important place. It pops up twice. From a practical point of view, what was the king doing there? Now, actually, he was probably inspecting the water supply for a city that was about to be besieged, in this case by the Arameans and the Israelites in north. For such a city, the water supply was life or death matter. It was all important that they had access to water. And we will see in the next chapter that water here becomes also an imagery of salvation, or the opposite. So here they are at a place which we see later in the book has symbolic significance. And Isaiah is bringing his son with this strange name. And then this is his message in chapter 7 to King Achaz. Don't be afraid of these two kings from Syria and from the northern kingdom of Ephraim. They will not win. They will be crushed. That is the message until verse 9 of the conversation between the king and the prophet. And then in verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Achaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign. Now, we should probably not all the time ask God for signs, but in this instance, it is God who wants Achaz to mention a sign, because God wants to comfort, to give a promise, but Achaz doesn't want to go into that. So he says, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. That sounds good, but his intentions were bad. Then Isaiah said in verse 13, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. So, this is of course the big question for most Christians who today read this chapter. Who was this Immanuel? From the New Testament perspective, most Christians know, especially shortly after Christmas, where we have sung, oh come, Immanuel, and many other songs like that. There we know from the Gospel of Matthew that this text is reused and applied to Jesus Christ and to Mary and virgin birth. But when you read the text in the context of Isaiah, it is first of all self-evident that there is a local historical fulfillment. The name for virgin does not in a technical sense mean virgin. It does apply to, in general, to unmarried, mature enough women to get married, and from that perspective, most likely virgins. But you see, there is a local fulfillment, a local historical fulfillment. That is evident when you read on. 15, he will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. In other words, there is a specific boy being born, he grows up, and he is a sign. That is a very literal sign. Now, how come then that we speak about this boy as something more than just this local boy, whoever his mother is, because we actually do not know that it is not mentioned explicitly. So scholars and commentators wonder, is it another son of the prophet? He has several sons with strange names. We have seen Shear-Yashub. In the chapter to follow, we have another one called Maher Shahal Hashbaz. That is a strange name too. But maybe this is not the prophet's son, because if so, why isn't that mentioned explicitly? We don't know exactly. I personally tend to think this is a young woman that the king is about to marry. But maybe somebody else has a better suggestion. In any case, when you read these texts about the sons of the prophet and this son, you realize quickly that their names have symbolic meaning, and that is used. Now, if you go to chapter 8, you have actually the name of Immanuel mentioned twice, even though this is not a specific reference to the virgin birth or to the young woman or to the boy itself. In verse 8, speaking about the tribulation arriving with the Assyrians, then there is a cry, "Oh, Immanuel," that is, in spite of all this, God is still with us. And verse 10, "For God is with us," reads the New International Version. That is the same, Immanuel, in Hebrew. So the names of the sons in these chapters are used in more than a local historical sense. They're used with a theological message. And that's not all. As you look at the larger literary context of these texts about the sons, you realize that the book of Isaiah is making the fact of children and childbirth a message in itself. You may remember the first that God is saying is in Isaiah in chapter 1 verse 2, "I have reared children." This is a basic foundational theme of the whole book. And as you move on from chapter 7, only a little later in chapter 9, you have a description that is fairly well known for most Christians, especially in times just after Christmas. "For us, unto us a child is born, a son is given, the government shall be on his shoulder." So this is the son of David. This is a Messiah. And notice that he is called Mighty God. Something more is involved than just the local historical boy. And as you read on, in chapter 37, when the Assyrian army is besieging Jerusalem and everything seems to be a defeat, King Hezekiah sends a message to the prophet Isaiah, and this is what he says in chapter 37, verse 3. "This is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth." He's not speaking about, in this case, a literal childbirth. He's using childbirth and sonship as an image for God's intervention to save. As you read on in the book of Isaiah, you have other texts that emphasize this unique way of using children and childbirth in the chapter. You have, in chapter 49, verse 20, you have Jerusalem, Zion, saying, "I have got children, though I was not pregnant." You have the same theme in the end of the book in chapter 66, 7-9. So when you look at it, you find that the New Testament may be using the reference to Immanuel, God with us, not simply to point out the virgin birth of Mary, which was unique, but to point out from within the context also of the book of Isaiah, point out that there is a larger message. God is with us, and children and childbirth, even within the literary context of Isaiah, is part of supporting that message. Thank you for listening to the Tidbits from the book of Isaiah. I hope you enjoy the study and you're welcome back as we move on into chapters 8 to 12. Thank you.